The Galactic Maritime Institute prided itself on producing the finest naval officers in known space, which was saying something considering the galaxy contained approximately 14 billion inhabited worlds, and counting. The Academy's crystalline spires rose from the surface of Kepler 442b, like the fingers of some cosmic deity reaching toward the stars, each one humming with a gentle resonance of artificial gravity generators that kept everyone's feet planted firmly on imported Terran marble, because nothing said sophisticated interstellar education quite like shipping stone across half the galaxy. The student body represented over 3,000 species, though if you ask the administration, they'd tell you with straight faces that they maintained strict diversity quotas. What they wouldn't mention was how those quotas conveniently favored species with the deepest pockets and the most political influence. The Zentaurians dominated the officer track with their four-armed elegance and trust funds the size of small planetary budgets. The crystalline Vorthak brought their silicon-based intellects and family mining operations that strip-mined asteroids for fun and profit. Even the gas giant dwelling Nephilim attended in their pressure suits, trailing clouds of methane and inherited wealth. And then there were the Deathworld species. Oh, the Academy accepted them naturally. Had to, really, ever since the Galactic Accords of 2387 mandated equal educational opportunities for all sentient species. But acceptance and welcome were two entirely different concepts. Much like how a black hole technically accepts matter, but nobody would call it hospitable. Deathworld species came from planets that most civilized beings wouldn't visit without a full hazmat suit and a will. These were worlds where evolution had decided that natural selection needed a serious productivity boost, where the local fauna considered a Category 5 hurricane a light breeze, and where the plants were more likely to eat you than photosynthesize peacefully. The graduates of such biological boot camps tended to be sturdy, resilient, and possessed of reflexes that made other species nervous. Which brought us to the current situation in the Academy's central promenade, where evolution was about to remind everyone why it never really stopped working. Vextar Klenok stood at the center of his usual entourage like a peacock, surrounded by slightly less impressive peacocks. His family owned 17 star systems, 43 corporations, and a small moon that they'd converted into a vacation resort. At 7 feet tall, with the traditional Zentaurian build, 4 arms and skin that shifted colors with his mood, he commanded attention simply by existing. His current shade of deep purple indicated either deep contemplation or mild constipation, and given his intellectual capacity, smart money was on the latter. "I simply cannot understand," he was saying to his assembled cronies, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone who'd never been told no in his entire privileged existence, "why the administration continues to admit these primitive specimens." The cronies murmured agreement, because that's what cronies did. They were a diverse bunch, representing some of the galaxy's most successful species, united by their shared ability to nod enthusiastically at whatever Vextar said. There was Quilth, a Vorthak whose crystalline form chimed softly when he moved, inherited mining fortune glittering beneath his transparent skin. Beside him stood Morak, a Nephilim whose pressure suit was probably worth more than most planets' GDP, methane occasionally puffing from his breathing apparatus like expensive incense. "The standards have clearly declined," agreed Trilix, a serpentine Ophidian whose family controlled the largest shipping consortium in the Outer Rim. "In my father's day, they would never have admitted anyone from a Class XII Deathworld." Vextar's skin shifted to a satisfied gold. "Exactly. We're supposed to be training the galaxy's future leaders, not whatever that is." He gestured with 2 of his 4 arms toward a corner table in the promenade's cafe area, where a solitary figure sat with her back to the wall, quietly working through what appeared to be advanced quantum navigation calculations. She was human, which meant she was from Earth, which meant she was from a planet that had tried to kill everything on it for roughly 4 billion years and had only partially succeeded. Nyx Torren didn't look particularly dangerous. She stood maybe 5.5 feet tall, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and clothes that favored function over fashion. Her skin had the particular pale quality of someone who spent more time in libraries than on beaches, and her eyes held the focused intensity of someone actually trying to learn something, rather than coast through on family connections. What made her dangerous wasn't her appearance, it was what Earth had built into her bones, her reflexes, her very DNA. Humans were persistence predators from a world where everything else was also trying to be a persistence predator. They were the species that had looked at the concept of flight or fight and decided to add pursue relentlessly across vast distances as a third option. But Nyx had been very, very careful not to let any of that show. She'd transferred to the Maritime Institute 6 months ago with academic credentials that made professors weep with joy and test scores that violated several statistical models. Her essays on stellar navigation were already being cited in academic journals. Her tactical simulations were so elegant that the AI systems asked for her autograph, and through it all, she'd maintained the demeanor of someone who wouldn't harm a fly, assuming the fly had proper documentation and followed academy regulations. The problem was that excellence, especially quiet excellence, had a way of making mediocrity uncomfortable. "Look at her," Vextar continued, his voice rising enough to carry across the promenade. "Sitting there like she actually belongs here, like she's not just some savage from a backwater planet who got lucky with a scholarship." Several other students had stopped their conversations to watch. The Maritime Institute's social hierarchy was as rigid as a neutron star's gravity well, and everyone knew their place in it. Vextar occupied the apex, the untouchable position of someone whose family could buy small governments as wedding presents. Below him were the various nobles, industrialists, and hereditary politicians who made up the Academy's social elite. At the bottom, barely registering on the social sensors, were the Deathworld species. Nyx had been listening to variations of this speech for months now. She'd developed an impressive ability to tune out the background noise of privilege and focus on her studies. After all, she hadn't come here to make friends or climb social ladders. She'd come here to learn, to prove something to herself, and to hopefully avoid the kind of incidents that tended to follow her people around like cosmic background radiation. Humans had a reputation. It wasn't entirely fair, but reputation rarely was. The galaxy had learned about humans during the Rigel incident of 2381, when a human freighter captain named Chen had been forced to defend a civilian transport from pirates. The pirates had been flying ships with enough firepower to reduce a small moon to component atoms. Chen had been piloting a cargo hauler with about as much offensive capability as a particularly aggressive fruit basket. The pirates had not survived the encounter. Neither had their base of operations, or the asteroid field they'd been hiding in. The official report had used terms like creative problem-solving and innovative tactical solutions. The unofficial reports had used terms like terrifying and someone please make sure they're on our side. Since then, humans had been welcomed into galactic society with the sort of enthusiasm typically reserved for active volcanoes or tax audits. Most species had learned to treat humans with careful respect, the way one might treat a nuclear weapon with a philosophy degree. But some species, particularly those who'd never faced genuine physical hardship, seemed to think that civilized behavior was the same as harmless behavior. It was a distinction that was about to become very, very important. "I heard," Vextar continued, now openly performing for the growing crowd, "that Deathworld species don't even use proper combat algorithms. They just attack, like animals." Nyx's stylus paused above her datapad, just for a moment, just long enough for someone paying attention to notice that her knuckles had gone white. "Apparently," Vextar went on, warming to his theme, "they're so primitive they still resolve conflicts with physical violence. Can you imagine, in this day and age, settling disputes with actual combat instead of proper legal channels?" What Vextar didn't know, because he'd never bothered to research anything that didn't directly benefit him, was that humans had spent the last century learning very, very hard lessons about the proper application of violence. They'd learned about proportional response, about de-escalation, about the importance of walking away from fights that didn't need to happen. They'd learned these lessons the way humans learned most things, through trial and error, with an emphasis on error, and with enough collateral damage to make the cleanup crews rich. The result was a species that had become almost pathologically careful about violence, treating it like a nuclear reaction that needed precise control systems to prevent catastrophic meltdowns. Most humans went their entire lives without throwing a punch, not because they couldn't, but because they understood exactly what would happen if they did. But like any nuclear reaction, it only took the right conditions to trigger a response. Of course, Vextor said, his voice now carrying clearly across the promenade, we shouldn't expect much from a species that probably clubbed their food to death. The stylus snapped in Nick's grip. Several students nearest to her took an involuntary step back. There was something about the way she'd gone completely still that triggered ancient predator-prey instincts buried deep in their evolutionary programming. It was the same stillness that preceded lightning strikes, avalanches, and other acts of nature that made insurance companies nervous. But Vextar was too caught up in his performance to notice. He was enjoying himself, playing to his audience, basking in the attention and the murmurs of agreement from his cronies. He'd never been in a real fight, had never faced genuine physical danger, had never learned the difference between confidence and arrogance. I wonder, he said, his voice dripping with manufactured contempt, if they even understand the concept of civilized behavior. Nick stood up. It wasn't a dramatic movement. She didn't leap to her feet or slam her chair back, or make any of the theatrical gestures that usually preceded confrontations in the holovids. She simply rose from her seat, with the same careful precision she brought to everything else, gathered her broken stylus and datapad, and began walking toward the exit. She was going to leave. She was going to walk away, find somewhere quiet to finish her work and pretend that she hadn't just listened to 10 minutes of species-based harassment disguised as social commentary. She was going to be the better person, the civilized person, the kind of person who proved that humans had evolved beyond their violent reputation. She made it 3 steps before Vextor decided that wasn't enough. "Oh, running away," he called out, his voice pitched to carry. "How very primitive." Nyx paused. Her shoulders tensed slightly, but she didn't turn around. "I suppose we shouldn't expect courage from a species that probably hides in caves when it storms." The crowd had gone quiet now, sensing that something was about to happen. Even the cronies were looking slightly uncomfortable, though whether from embarrassment or anticipation was hard to say. Nyx took a deep breath and continued walking. She almost made it to the exit before Vextor's arrogance overrode what little common sense he possessed. Later, investigators would spend weeks trying to determine exactly what had motivated him to leave his position of safety and follow her. Some theorized that he'd been caught up in the moment, drunk on the attention and approval of his audience. Others suggested that he genuinely believed his own propaganda about primitive species being naturally cowardly. The truth was probably simpler. He'd never learned that there was a difference between someone who couldn't fight back and someone who chose not to. "Hey," he said, reaching out with one of his forearms to grab her shoulder. "I'm talking to you, savage." What happened next took approximately 0.3 seconds. Nyx's body responded to the unwelcome contact, the way a mousetrap responds to pressure, instantly, precisely, and with entirely more force than the situation seemed to warrant. Her left hand snapped up to intercept his wrist, her grip closing like a steel trap around bones that had never known real stress. Her right elbow drove backward into his solar plexus with the accumulated force of a species that had learned hand-to-hand combat from predators who considered humans a light snack. As Vextar doubled over, gasping for breath that his collapsed diaphragm couldn't provide, Nyx pivoted on her left foot and drove her right knee upward into his descending face. The impact sounded like a gavel striking marble, crisp and final. But she wasn't done. As he began to fall backward, Nyx's right hand grabbed the back of his neck and pulled him down, while her left hand pressed against his spine. The leverage was perfect, the angle precisely calculated, and the force applied exactly where evolution had left Zentorians most vulnerable. The sound of Vextar's spinal column separating from itself was remarkably quiet, like the pop of a champagne cork, if champagne corks cost several million credits in medical bills. He hit the floor like a sack of very expensive vegetables, his forearms flopping uselessly as his nervous system tried to send signals to parts of his body that were no longer accepting calls. The entire sequence had taken less time than it took most people to blink. Nyx stood over him for a moment, her breathing perfectly controlled, her expression mildly annoyed, as though she'd just dealt with a particularly persistent telemarketer. Then she knelt down, checked his pulse with the same clinical precision she brought to her navigation calculations, and looked up at the stunned crowd. "Someone should probably call medical," she said, in the same tone she might use to point out that it was raining. "I think I may have damaged his C4 vertebra." The crowd stared at her in the kind of shocked silence usually reserved for natural disasters or tax bills. Even the cronies had gone quiet, their various atmospheric processes and breathing apparatus creating a symphony of nervous, biological functions. "Also," Nix added, standing up and brushing imaginary dust from her uniform, "he's going to need a very good lawyer. Assault charges are serious business." And with that, she walked calmly toward the exit, leaving behind a tableau that would be discussed in hushed tones for years to come. The medical team arrived within minutes, their anti-grav stretchers and emergency equipment creating a small tornado of activity around Vextar's motionless form. The lead physician, a elderly Altarian whose tentacles moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd seen everything, ran her scanners over the patient and delivered her diagnosis with the bedside manner of someone who'd learned long ago that sugarcoating rarely helped. "Severed spinal cord," she announced to the assembled crowd. "Clean separation at the C4 vertebra. Whoever did this has an excellent understanding of Zentorian anatomy." The implications hung in the air like a bad smell. "Is he going to be okay?" asked Quilth, his crystalline form chiming nervously. The physician's tentacles rippled in what might have been a shrug. "He'll live. Whether he'll ever walk again depends on how good his family's medical insurance is, and how much they're willing to spend on experimental procedures." As the medical team loaded Vextar onto their stretcher and whisked him away to the Academy's trauma center, the crowd began to disperse. But the conversations had already started, rippling outward through the Academy's social networks like waves from a stone dropped in still water. By evening, everyone knew what had happened. By the next morning, the story had spread to other campuses, other systems, other species. By the end of the week, the incident had become the subject of academic papers, legal precedents, and at least 3 different Holovid documentaries. The investigation, when it finally concluded, found that Nix had acted in self-defense. The security footage clearly showed Vextar initiating physical contact, and the Academy's own harassment policies supported her right to respond to unwelcome touching. The fact that her response had been somewhat more decisive than anyone had expected was, according to the legal experts, entirely beside the point. Vextar's family hired the best lawyers money could buy and threatened to sue everyone from Nix to the Academy to the company that had manufactured the flaw he'd fallen on. The lawyers took one look at the case, calculated the odds of success, and quietly advised their clients to settle for covering their son's medical expenses and enrolling him in a very good therapy program. The Academy, meanwhile, quietly updated their diversity training materials to include a section on recognizing and respecting Deathworld species. They also installed new medical equipment, specifically designed to handle the kinds of injuries that occurred when civilized beings forgot that civilization was a choice, not a biological inevitability. As for Nix, she returned to her studies with the same quiet focus she'd always shown. Her grades remained excellent, her tactical simulations continued to impress the faculty, and her essays on stellar navigation were still being cited in academic journals. The only difference was that now she ate lunch in peace, studied in libraries that remained mysteriously quiet, and walked through corridors where conversations stopped as she passed. She'd become something of a legend, though she seemed entirely unaware of her new status. When asked about the incident by reporters, she'd simply stated that she'd responded to an assault according to her training and that she hoped Vextar would recover quickly. When pressed for details about her background, she'd politely declined to comment and suggested that they speak to the Academy's public relations department. What she didn't mention, because no one had asked the right questions, was that she'd actually shown considerable restraint. Her training had included 17 different ways to disable a Zentorian, 12 of which would have been fatal. She'd chosen the option that would neutralize the threat while giving her attacker the best chance of eventual recovery. It was, in its own way, a very civilized approach to violence. The incident had broader implications than anyone realized at the time. Other Deathworld species, who'd been quietly enduring their own versions of harassment and discrimination, suddenly found themselves treated with a new level of respect. The casual bullying that had been a feature of Academy life disappeared almost overnight, replaced by a careful politeness that acknowledged the difference between weakness and patience. More importantly, the galaxy's understanding of what it meant to be civilized underwent a subtle but significant shift. The old definition had equated civilization with the absence of violence, with the ability to resolve conflicts through words and laws and proper channels. The new definition recognized that true civilization might actually require the capacity for violence, held in check by the wisdom to use it only when necessary. It was a lesson that rippled outward through galactic society, changing everything from diplomatic protocols to insurance rates for Deathworld species. The Galactic Maritime Institute, which had prided itself on producing the finest naval officers in known space, discovered that perhaps the finest officers were those who understood that sometimes the most civilized thing you could do was remind someone that civilization was a choice everyone had to make, every day, in every interaction. And in the crystalline spires of the Academy, where the artificial gravity kept everyone's feet planted firmly on imported marble, the students learned that sometimes the most important lessons weren't found in textbooks or tactical simulations. Sometimes they were found in the simple recognition that strength and gentleness weren't opposites, but partners in the delicate dance of civilized behavior. The promenade returned to its usual bustle of academic life, but with a new understanding humming through the corridors like the gentle resonance of the gravity generators. Respect wasn't something you demanded or inherited or bought with family money. It was something you earned by recognizing that everyone, regardless of their species or their planet of origin, had the right to be treated with dignity. And if you forgot that lesson, well, there was always physical therapy. After all, civilization was a choice, and sometimes the galaxy needed a reminder of what happened when people chose poorly.